When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video we're going to be continuing our reread, and we're going to be getting back into Dany. It's been quite a while since we've actually done a Dany chapter, and our first two chapters are absolute bangers. Two of my most highly rated chapters so far in the reread, and we've had kind of a time skip. So at the end of the last chapter we did for Dany, it was really about her marriage to Drogo, that consummation of that marriage. And now we've skipped, and she's been with the Dothraki for a couple of weeks, it would seem, and she's just getting more into their culture, and she's also a different character by the time we've gotten to this point. Dany, in her first chapter, her first and her second chapter, is someone that's very timid. She doesn't really stand up for herself very much. She has a very low confidence. Being with the Dothraki and learning their ways has definitely brought out more of a confident Dany, and really this is the chapter that starts to bring Dany into her own, and we'll see her and Viserys' conflict brim come to a boiling point within this episode. So before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do, and it helps channel grow people that might like this content as well. And let's get into page 226. So the chapter opens with Jorah and Dany riding next to each other like we see in the image I have on screen, and Jorah notes that they are in the Dothraki Sea. Kind of an ironic name because it's not a sea at all. It's just a very big, like, open kind of plain with a lot of grass. There aren't a lot of hills, there aren't a lot of mountains, and that's what Dany notes as well. Jorah then continues saying how there are different types of grasses and flowers depending on the place and time of the year. An interesting line here is that a certain flower makes the Dothraki Sea look bloody, and this is kind of, in my opinion, a little bit of a reference to the Dothraki culture. They usually are very warlike people, and blood is something that is very common, and violence is very common in their culture. When we see like deaths at weddings and stuff like that, it seems like it's brewed into their culture. So I thought that was a nice little parallel, tying in their atmosphere and their home to the actual people. And we also learn of another grass known as the ghost grass that grows in a shy, and it kills all other grasses. Now the Dothraki believe that one day it will cover the world, and that will be the end of the world. Interesting to note, maybe bringing up the idea that a shy could be the thing that ends the world. Very interesting. Maybe not in the way that the Dothraki view it, but just maybe some of their magic and some of their mysterious things going on there could lead to the end of the world. That gets us into page 227. So continuing on, we see that Dany tries to switch the subject. She doesn't really want to talk about death, and she thinks about how Viserys is still struggling riding and hates it out here. Now, this is one thing we're going to see is very common between Dany and Viserys. Dany is someone that is willing to adapt to her surroundings. She is someone that has a much higher survivability. She takes it upon herself to get more ingrained with Dothraki culture if she's going to be a Khaleesi. Viserys is someone that isn't doing that, and that's very much noted by Dany in this chapter. Now, Dany wishes that he would have stayed in Pentos, and that Illyrio had also urged him to do so, which is interesting because how different could the story have been if Viserys had actually stayed in Pentos? Now, the really interesting thing when we look at how the story plays out is that what would have Dany have done? Would that have changed her entire thought process after Drogo dies? Would she have gone back to Viserys? That would be an interesting idea. Also with Illyrio, we know that he is also favoring young Griff more so than Viserys and Dany, so how would he kind of react to Viserys still being around? I think that's an interesting point to think about as well. But Viserys intends to stay with Drogo, and he does this really because he doesn't want to get cheated of this trade. He will wait until the debt is paid and he has his crown, and if he tries to cross him, Viserys will show him the meaning of waking the dragon as he touches his sword. Again, I've been talking about this in a lot of videos, and especially in this reread. There's a very common theme of younger characters threatening violence and showing their steel or their swords when they really have no intent to do so, or there's no real fight. And it shows the immaturity of a lot of these characters, like a Rob, like an Arya, like we talked about in last chapter. So I thought that was a nice, interesting tie-in with our, I guess, our main plot, and this is kind of the B plot for now. And Illyrio again has one of these moments where Dany can tell. He can tell this is very foolish talk, and he lets it be shown, which Viserys never picks up. And Dany then decides that she does not want to hear her brother's complaints and wants to ride on in this beautiful day, and commands Jorah to tell the rest to stop. So again, we had kind of her remembering, what Illyrio was telling Viserys. We come back to normal time because they've been riding all day. And Dany is like, you know what? I kind of just want to see everything. Let's have everyone stop. And she doesn't want to hear Viserys complaining because presumably he's kind of behind her somewhere, and she can just hear him being very annoying. So she commands them to stop. Now let's think about Dany in Dany 2. Would Dany be commanding anyone to just do this? No. And that's what I love that we see here, is that we didn't really need to see it, because we're going to get some like flashbacks and or Dany remembering her struggles early on with integrating in this culture. But now she's taken on to that role and understood what her power is. So Dany then describes Jorah as well, saying that he's not very handsome and he's extremely hairy, but he's very strong. She also notes that, with this being said, his smiles do give her comfort. So again, I think Dany views Jorah more like a father figure type character, or more maybe like a older man that's like an advisor or a friendly face to her, not something like a romantic interest. And that's what Jorah does pursue in the future, and is very suspicious as we go on and later in the story. Jorah says, "You're beginning to talk like a queen," and Dany responds, "Not a queen, a Khaleesi." Again, Dany is showing what her position is. She's not Viserys, who Viserys is claiming he's already this king, even though he has no power. Dany is showing that she understands her power. She understands that she's a Khaleesi. She's not overreaching like a Viserys. I think that's very important to establish with Dany's character early on. And then Dany then begins to recount their journey after the wedding, and for a time she struggled. On her third day out on the journey to Vaes Dothrak, which is where they are going, she thought she was going to die from the saddle sores on her bottom. She describes how her muscles were in such pain she needed help getting out of the saddle, and her hands were blistered. Even the night brought no relief. And again, we see that this is not an easy life. Being this person like Dany, who is not someone that frequently rides a horse for long hours, she is not someone used to the struggles of a Dothraki Khalasar. She's trying to integrate into that. And she's a very strong woman for being able to get through these things. And it builds her up to why, at this point of the story, she is now becoming someone that has more authority, more power, because she's gone through these things, that she has also not only gained people's respect, but she herself is starting to respect her strength as a character, or as a person. And why the night brings no relief is that Drogo, comes in to have sex with her, trying to get her with a child. And also Dany feels very alone. Drogo pays her no real attention except at night, and he takes her from behind. So it's not like a mutual thing. It just seems where Dany is just kind of an object to Drogo. And that's kind of why Dany feels so alone. And she really only has her brother and Jorah to eat and be safe with, or to eat and be with. She feels completely isolated at this point. And it's something I mentioned with Arya in the last chapter, where there's a lot of people around, but she doesn't really feel like she has people to talk to, because again, we know that Dany is very annoyed with her brother Viserys, and Jorah is this character that's not exactly like a friend to her, really. Like, he's more of like an advisor, a protector type. He's not like, another 15-year-old girl for Daenerys to actually connect with. And this pattern got so bad that at one point she thought killing herself would be better than living. And again, that shows deeply how tough this is. And when Dany comes out of this cycle for the better, Dany now has that chip on her shoulder, like, I've been through all of this. I was at such a low point that I thought about killing myself. What worse thing could there be, you know? And I think that's a very strong message, and I think it's why a lot of people love Daenerys. And again, I am someone that likes Daenerys. This is probably my favorite part of her story, is this opening part, because it does such a great job of connecting with other storylines, like Jon and Dany in the first book, in my opinion, are very similar character arcs or characters, even though they have completely different things going on. And this is one of those things that I really like about Dany, and how she comes into her own and becomes this really important character. But that night, and this is a very similar theme we see with Dany, especially early on, is when she's extremely stressed out, when she's at her lowest, her darkest, she always has these dragon dreams. When she goes into this dream, she sees a dragon very similar to what Drogon will eventually be, and she is engulfed in flame, but she is not hurt. If anything, when she wakes up, she is stronger and more fierce. Even her handmaidens see a difference, again supporting the idea that these dragon dreams have power, and they build up Daenerys' confidence, and they are important to her. Again, very important and strong foreshadowing to what will happen at the end of this book when the dragons do awake. And that gets us into page 229. Dany then, when she had woken up again with her handmaiden, stated that she looked different and stuff. She went to the eggs, and she went to the eggs that she had received, and she specifically goes to the black and scarlet egg, the one just like the dragon in her dream. And she touches it, and it feels warm. And she questions if this was still her dream or not. Again, more foreshadowing to the awakening of the dragons and how they are warm. Dany then starts to remember how after that day, she had grown stronger each day until riding was no longer that bad. Again, and when you look at Dany, she is this character that becomes stronger, not just physically, but also mentally. And that is a very big turning point for Dany as a whole. And Dany also notes how her horse Silver seems to share a connection to her. And I noted that this was very similar to the direwolves, which I thought was very interesting. Her horse Silver seems like they know where they're going, that they don't need Dany's direction, that their minds are kind of connected, that when her mood was bad, it seemed like Silver's mood was also bad. And now that Dany is not struggling on riding anymore and going through the pains of that, she's able to look around and see the beauty of the land. And she even goes to the front of the column, which is very important for, I guess, for sightseeing. Because if you think about it, this is this large Khalasar, thousands and thousands of horses. The land and the ground gets destroyed on their marches. And Dany doesn't want to see that. She wants them to not be spoiled. She wants to see the land, and it keeps her interested while she's riding. It's very similar to, say, a character like Arya when they're coming down from the north during the Trident section of that portion. And she lastly notes how all the animals fled from the Khalasar as well. And again, we also see that the Khalasar is very smart. I mean, even when we look at, season 8, right? When we're talking about, Dany doesn't have anybody scouting out, for her dragons getting attacked by Euron and stuff. Even the Khalasar, which a lot of, people in Westeros believe is this very underdeveloped culture where they're not, I guess, civil, even they have outriders. Dany specifically notes that nothing would get to the Khalasar without their outriders and scouts knowing. And I think that's very important to note, that the Khalasar are very strategical in the way they move and their, I guess, military mind. And that gets us into page 230. Now, Dany states that she is now happy to get into the saddle, to see what awaits next, and that even her sex with Drogo is not always painful, but sometimes is more pleasurable. So again, we see that Daenerys' whole outlook on life has now started to change because of how she's adapting to her situation. And when we see Viserys, who's a character that's not doing these things, we understand why he's still miserable, because he hasn't gotten used to it. He hasn't really built up this strength like Dany has. And it also shows Dany just connecting a bit more with Drogo, which is something that'll be paid off at the end of this chapter as a whole. And as Dany, and we're going back to present time, Dany continues to ride alone, and she knows that she's never truly alone. Yes, she does feel lonely, but she's never really alone in the Khalasar, right? She has constant attention from handmaidens and the Cow's men and her brother. And As she is thinking about this, she hears Viserys in the distance, very angry with Jorah. With this, Dany has an urge to go on foot to touch the ground, and at this point, Viserys rides up. And Viserys, he doesn't like being bossed around, because again, if we go back to the beginning of the chapter, Dany basically told the whole Khalisar to stop. And Viserys comes in, he's angry, he is thinking, who are you to order me around, and that she is a slut, and that he is the king of the Seven Kingdoms. He then begins to dig into her breast, again playing on the note that Viserys is definitely attracted to Daenerys, and we find out that even more specifically later on in the books. But he definitely has an attraction for Dany. And we also note here that Dany is adopting more to Dothraki culture with riding leathers and going barefoot, and Viserys is not. He is in chainmail, horrible for this condition of riding, and not only that, but also it's extremely hot. And at this, Dany has enough of it and shoves Viserys away hard. Now, I want you guys to think about this. Let's go back to Dany 1. Dany was so scared to even talk to Viserys, to voice her own opinions, and now she is physically standing up for herself. That should tell you right away how much this character has grown. And I really love the mini arc that we've already gotten from Dany in her first 3 chapters. I think of all of the characters so far, POV wise, I think she has the strongest start, even though we don't see like a ton of her, right? Like there's a lot of other characters that up to this point already have 4 chapters. But she definitely starts out very strong. And Viserys, I think, notes that, right? He is shocked to be stood up to. He's not used to this. He's been able to bully Dany his entire life. He's been able to really bully people in general his whole life. And Dany thinks, again, this is the important part, because Dany is not this character already that she just is fully the Khaleesi. She is fully confident with herself. She notes in her head that he will hurt her bad for this. And again, I noted in my notes that we see now that Dany is still a bit afraid of Viserys. She is still growing and trying to find her confidence. She's not fully there, right? This is really like the big turning point for her life and her as a person, but she hasn't reached that point yet, as she will later on in the books, and this book specifically. At this moment, a crack is heard, and Jogo has Viserys in a chokehold with his whip. He says something that Dany does not understand, and Irri says that he asks if you want him dead. Which again, Dany again is not at this point where she wants her brother dead. She still cares about her brother despite his faults. And I think even, when we get later in the book and Viserys does end up dying, Dany still, I think, cares about him, but it's this balance in Dany's mind of being afraid of him and also still caring about him. Which of those is going to win out? And is Daenerys finally going to be fully standing up to Viserys? And that's kind of what we're building upon in this beginning part for Daenerys. Jogo and other Dothraki at this point then begin to laugh, and Irri translates that she should take an ear from him to teach him respect, which I think might be a good idea. Maybe if Viserys got humbled a little bit, maybe. Now, I don't think it would work out. I think Viserys would be even more bitter and would try to just straight up kill Dany, and then he would die even earlier. But, And Dany again says that she does not want him harmed, and she notices that he is struggling for breath. And in an instant, Jogo lets him go, and he sprawls onto the ground with a mark that is bleeding at his throat. And again, we have to also think that this is probably the first time that Viserys has actually been, assaulted by someone. That anyone has dared to do this to the great Viserys, the king of Westeros. It's a big moment for Viserys, because up to this point, Viserys hasn't really had any repercussions for his actions. And this is the first moment, and it's only going to get worse from him as he was, physically assaulting the Khaleesi, which is a huge offense. And Jorah tells Dany that he told Viserys what would happen and told him to stay, and Dany says she knows. Dany kind of comes off as like a disappointed parent in this moment, where she's just like, yeah, I know, he's just a troubled child. And that's kind of how she comes off here, and I think it's very funny. But Dany kind of gets over the last bit of her fear, and she sees him for the pathetic person he is, lying on the ground. She commands his horse to be taken for him. and that he is to march at the end of the Khalasar. And this is a huge insult. This is, think about this culture. This culture, they're very close with horses. You have your horse taken, and you have to march at the very back of the line with the slaves. Viserys basically just got the worst punishment you could possibly get for the Dothraki. It is better for a Dothraki to die in battle on their horse than for what Dany does to Viserys here. And it's a big blow to Viserys' ego. And Dany herself, again, this is showing how she doesn't fully understand how much confidence and power she has, because she's shocked to hear her own words. And Viserys, as well, is stunned for the second time in this chapter. Viserys then tries to refute this and pleads to Jorah to hit Dany and punish her and to kill the Dothraki's dogs. And again, Viserys does not adapt well. He doesn't understand the situation. Dany controls all of the power in this situation. And Jorah, if he even tried to do this, would also be killed. Viserys just does not see what this is. If Viserys wanted to get out of this, he would try to apologize to Dany and try to come off a little bit nicer. And he does the opposite, threatening Dany once again. So again, not a great decision-making process there from Viserys. But that will get us into page 232. Now, moving on. Jorah, not being an idiot, says to Dany that he will walk. Very obvious choice. We're glad Jorah didn't make a stupid decision here. And again, even after all this, we see how Dany still cares for him. As they walk back, she asks Jorah if he can find his way back, or if he will even want to come back. Again, she doesn't want to lose Viserys. Like, she doesn't want anything bad to happen to Viserys. She kind of just wants to put him in his place a little bit. And Jorah refutes this, saying it's literally impossible to lose our trail, and which that's completely true. Like, how would you miss this trail of like all this trampled grass? It may take him a while, but he'll find it. And we also get back to that point I was talking about earlier, where Dany notes how nothing can sneak up on the Khalasar, how they have scouts and outriders to protect them. Nothing would get to them before Drogo already knew. Which again, it's very similar to what we're going to see with like Robb and the Blackfish. But I think that's interesting to note that they are very smart when it comes to that part of their culture. And again, we see Dany fall back into her old self as she thinks on what she did. She had hit Viserys, her brother, and she thinks how this will wake the dragon. So again, Dany is, the whole point of this is that Dany, yes, is finding her confidence, but she also has a little bit there where she's not sure if she's making the right decisions, and she has a little bit of that fear, and she's a little bit afraid. And I think that's what's really compelling about Dany early on in this story. Jorah then refutes this, saying, "You cannot wake the dead. Rhaegar was the last dragon. Viserys is but a serpent or a snake." And Dany is shocked. She says, "But you swore to him." And Jorah says, "Yes, what does that make his servants bitterly?" And again, that's a great point, right? So Jorah is serving Viserys, or at this point, it's kind of loose, like that he's actually serving Viserys. He's more serving Dany than he is Viserys, but Jorah thinks about, like, this is an interesting idea. If you are serving someone that is just an awful person, what does that make you? What does that make you? That's an interesting point that's very relevant to a character like Jaime, and I think that's a great idea of just planting that idea. Now, Dany says he is the true king of Westeros, again, still playing on the fact of how young Dany is. And again, Dany, he still thinks of, like, Viserys as the one true king, but she just doesn't realize, I guess, at this point, that he'll never really be able to do that until Jorah kind of brings up the conversation in the next page. And that will also get us into page 233. So moving on, we see that Jorah pulls up, and he kind of gets serious with Dany. And he says, "Do you want Viserys to sit the throne?" And Dany obviously says he would be a bad king. And Jorah says, not the worst, but close to it. And I agree with that. I mean, I don't think Viserys would be the worst king. I think he would be very bad. But the Targaryens have had a lot of bad kings, so I just think he'd be on that bottom half. So I agree with Jorah on that. And Dany then suggests, well, Lyrio says the people are waiting for Viserys to cross and reclaim the throne. And again, we had talked about how in Dany 1, because that's another point that's brought up, is that Dany does question that. She's not sure if that's 100% true, but she does have like the instincts, and she's smart enough to realize that may not be true. And Jorah tells her exactly that in this page. He tells her the people don't really care about the Game of Thrones. They care about rain, healthy children, and a summer that never ends. Again, things that personally impact them. Because who the king is for a lot of common folk don't necessarily impact them outside of things like the economy. But Dany then thinks on this for a while, and there's a bit of a silence. And I think what George is trying to show here is that Dany hasn't really thought about this a lot. And she's always been just basically put into her mind by Viserys that, that they're going to go back to the Westeros and all these people are going to be on their side and Viserys is going to be a good king. And Dany questions it, but she sees the truth in what Jorah is stating. Dany then asks Jorah what he prays for. Jorah longingly says home, and Dany agrees. But Jorah tells her to look around, but Dany is thinking of, again, Westeros, of Dragonstone, and the Red Keep. And she says, interestingly, all of them have red doors, referring again to this mysterious home she had when she was younger. So this is going to be a major theme of Dany's character. Is Dany has really only felt like she had a little bit of a childhood at this mysterious home in Braavos that had a red door. Again, people theorize that maybe it's not in Braavos. I am someone that does believe it is in Braavos, and I feel like it was kind of confirmed in Dance. But, again, that's not the point of this video. The point of it is that Dany has a longing for a place of home where she could be safe. And that's something, unfortunately, that I maybe do not see happening for Dany. But Dany then comes to the right conclusion. She says Viserys will not take her home. Even with a Dothraki army, he could not do it. Viserys is a terrible leader who does not inspire loyalty, but inspires weakness. Something that the Dothraki hate more than anything. And Dany kind of feels like she's known this her whole life, but at this point, she's been too afraid to speak it until now. And Dany is very wise in her words here. Viserys would not be able to reclaim the Iron Throne. It doesn't matter who backed him, what was going on. Maybe if he had a really great council of people advising him, would he be able to do it? But given the situation, he's just not going to be able to do that. And Dany, I think this is where Dany really takes it upon herself to, if the Targaryens are going to reclaim the throne, it's going to be through her. And that gets us to page 234. Jorah, then backing up what I said, calls her a very wise child, and Dany says she is no child and rides off faster until dusk. And again, we get this idea of children or people having to grow up fast. Remember, Dany is only, I believe she's 14 right now. She's very young, and she's saying here that she's not a child anymore, which, yeah, she's had to grow up. She's gone through a ton of struggles that no 14-year-old should have to. I think it's fair to assume that she is a young adult at this point with all of the experiences that she's had to go through. She then learns that her tent has already been set up by slaves and that by this point everyone will know that Viserys is a walker, a great shame like what we talked about earlier on. And that most importantly, there are no secrets in the Khalasar. And this is important to note for a couple of reasons. One, because at the end of this chapter, we'll have Drogo and Dany sleeping together, basically in front of the entire Khalasar, out under the stars. And it's going to be a situation where Dany flips the usual customs of sex. And it's also going to show Dany as someone that is very progressive in the way she wants to deal with the Khalasar law and or customs. But more importantly, it also shows that when Drogo is dying, later on in the book, there's no secrets in the Khalasar. Everyone knows it. They see the weakness. And that's something that I think Dany kind of forgets later on in the story. Now, when she enters the tent, she notices scarlet flames, and she goes to touch the black egg, and again, it is very warm. Again, more foreshadowing. But Dany says, well, they've been out in the sun for a while, and maybe that is why. She then has a bath prepared, and she asks her handmaidens if they've ever seen a dragon. Jiqui replies that she heard dragons first came from the east in the Shadowlands past Ashai, and maybe there are still some in the Jade Sea. Again, building on the idea of Ashai being this mysterious place of magic where possibly dragons came from or over there in that area. And her other handmaidens disagree, saying that dragons all died long ago. And that gets us into page 235. And something I want to note here is that the dragons really didn't die that long ago. If you think about it, they died about 150 years ago-ish from this point of the story. The dragons were alive, like within 2 lifetimes ago, basically. And Dany kind of thinks about this exact point. She thinks about what Viserys told her about the last dragons dying during Aegon III's reign, which did not seem so long ago, which entirely it really wasn't. And Dany thinks that why not dragons being still around? She hears of the mysteries of sorcery and blood magic in Ashai and the basilisks at YT. Why not dragons? Which is an interesting point. Like, there is still magic going on in the world to this point, but no dragons from what we know of at this point. And Eerie notes that brave men killed the evil dragons, which is not entirely true. I mean, for the most part, brave men didn't. A lot of the times it was dragons killing other dragons. And then if you're talking the dragon pit, it wasn't really brave men. It was just a lot of people that were really pissed off, that were starving to death and had basically been propped up to kill the dragons. But yeah, fair enough. And we see that her handmaidens were all slaves or bed warmers. Again, showing the ethics and culture of the Dothraki, where they take slaves, they put slaves into positions, and that's kind of something that Dany will learn to hate later on. Doria then refutes that, saying a traitor from Qarth, struggle on the name there, had told her the dragons come from the moon, that one of the moons wandered too close to the sun and it hatched thousands of dragons, and the sun allowed them to breathe fire, which is it's a much more interesting story, albeit probably unlikely. The other handmaidens refute this, saying that the moon is wife to sun. Again, we make an interesting idea here that what if Dany is kind of the moon wife to Drogo, and she is the one that hatches the eggs? Now, again, the idea here is that the moon splits, right? If Dany, by the end of this, is that person that brings dragons back into the world, and we constantly see the moon and wife comparison between Drogo and Dany, is that an interesting point and another little wink to the dragons coming back? And after this, Dany is cleaned and made more presentable. And that gets us into page 236. So 236 begins with Dany telling Doria to stay, and this was again to teach Dany how to pleasure Drogo. We see this like as an actual scene in the TV show. In the book, it's kind of just implied. I mean, Dany, we don't get a whole scene between the two. And then when Drogo arrives to the tent, she undresses herself and says, "Tonight we must go outside under the stars." Again, I talked earlier that this is important for a couple reasons. One, in Dothraki culture, is important for all things that matter to be done under the open sky, like her wedding was in Dany 2. And two, she is in full view of the Khalasar, again, hiding nothing from them, and showing the Khalasar that Dany is a woman that has power, that is going to be progressive in how she rules as a Khaleesi with Khal Drogo as well. She then begins to seduce Drogo, and instead of the customary way of things, she instead mounts him instead, and does so well with this that Drogo calls out her name before climaxing. And while doing this, Dany notes that all eyes are on her, but she does not care. Again, showing that Dany is full of confidence. She is coming into her own as this Targaryen. Later, Jiqui brushes her fingers across Dany and says, "You are with child." And Dany says, she knows. And we also find out that this is only her 14th name day. And that is how the chapter ends. So this chapter kind of goes out with a bang. It's really about Dany coming into her own, about being this woman that is very powerful physically, mentally, emotionally. And by the end of it, we have a big twist that she is now pregnant. And how will that affect a character like Viserys? How will that impact the normal story when our characters in Westeros find out? And this is a huge part of the story that connects Dany with a character like Ned. And this is why I love Dany in this book. She's very connected with the other plot lines, and a lot of the things she's going through can be connected in theme-wise with a lot of other characters, like I mentioned with John. So thank you guys all for watching this video. I really have loved these first 3 Dany chapters. They're some of my favorites of the first book. And that's just going to continue with Dany. Dany is a very strong character in this book. And I really like her. As much as, you know, I say I'm not the biggest Dany fan, I am a pretty big Dany fan in this first book. So I hope you guys all enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.